We're here live at Salford University for the first of a number of specials focusing on issues that impact you in places like this up and down the country. This show provides a platform to have your say on issues that impact you. Today, we look at social media in today's world and the impact of climate change on all of us, as well as reflect on last week's local elections. Joined by our wonderful studio audience and today's panel, we'll ask your questions about the issues impacting you.
And I'm here at the big screen, getting your reactions, asking your questions and bringing you the facts and figures from the issues today.
And joining me on the panel today, Joe Wilmot, a recent graduate and now production lead at an edutech startup. Eva Bamber from the University of Manchester, studying a Masters in International Development. And Adam Clark, a student journalist from right here at the University of Salford. Remember to have your say. Contact us using the hashtag the comment section to ask our panel your own questions. So first up today, in the fallout of last week's local elections, it's apparent that voter turnout has fallen, and it was especially low amongst younger people. So the question we're asking is, why? Joe, why do you think this might be the case?
Primarily for two reasons. I think Partygate and the cost of living, they're the two major issues in the headlines that, were at the forefront of everyone's viewing right up to the election. But I think if people thought that voting Labour or moving away from the Tories was going to stick it to the Tories, I think you'd be wrong. I don't think that's what would have happened. I think people choosing who takes their bins out is not exactly going to tell, the senior Tory leadership that Boris needs to go or the Tories need to be out. So I don't think that the local elections are a good representation at all of what should actually happen in Westminster.
Eva, how about yourself? Did you vote on Thursday?
I did, yeah. I think voting is still important, but I also understand why turnout has been so low. I think a lot of young people feel like they haven't really got much of a choice when it comes to current parties. It's very much either Tory or Labour, who can, in honesty, be seen as two sides of the same coin. We've seen in America, like even with a Democrat president, not all issues are suddenly being solved. Abortion is being criminalised and student debt is definitely not being, cancelled anytime soon. And so young people, they aren't being educated on any alternatives that they might have. There are hardly any small parties. You can maybe vote for the Green Party, but you are being told that there's no use casting your vote for anything other than Tory and Labour. And if you don't see yourself represented in either of those parties, then you might choose to not go to the polls.
And were you aware exactly of what you were voting for when you voted on Thursday?
I think so. I think council elections are very important, and I think they do represent the community and especially a local action that needs to happen. A councillor is an important job to provide social services and public services to the community, and I think it's still very important to go and cast your vote and show your opinion.
Adam, how about yourself? What's your opinion on the matter?
I think it's an interesting one because if you look at the statistics of the turnout across Greater Manchester and nationally as well, you're looking at sort of 20 to 40%. So it's not just young people that aren't turning out to vote. It seems to be everyone across the country. And I think, like we were saying there about Partygate and sort of the national issues don't really affect, exactly like you said, who takes your bins out and all that.
So if you're a young person yourself, what is it that you think these councils could be doing for young people that might influence a sway in voting?
I think if you're bringing in younger people into those positions, if you look at many local councillors these days, they're probably over the age of 40 and sort of maybe you're might not be as approachable for sort of a young person. If you've got sort of maybe someone that's sort of like 20 or 30, you might feel to be able to approach them either sort of via email or the phone or go up to them at a sort of council meeting.
Fantastic. And I believe, Courtney, we've got the results that are going to come up on screen from the Salford.
We do.
Results.
We have a lovely map for you which shows us our local results in Salford. So we had 20 of the 60 seats up for grabs this month when they did the election. Labour is still having, a large majority, but they have actually lost some seats. So they're down by 3 to 15 of the areas. Conservatives have gone up by 1 and Lib Dems have gone up by 1. So I think it's right what you said, Joe, that people really aren't, they're not thinking, I'm going to get the Conservatives out because they're not taking my bins out, They've changed, they've gained a point in our area, even though we were always higher in Labour.
And is that an independent candidate as well that's just been elected?
Yeah, we've got a nice little one over here who's just cropped up out of nowhere.
Just one in the corner, fantastic. Yeah. Also, to answer an earlier question before about younger voters, we've actually got our local councillor, Alex Warren of the Lib Dems, who's actually from the local Salford Quays, and we'll see his thoughts now.
My name's Alex Warren. I work for the Liberal Democrats. I'm a local councillor in Salford Quays and Media City. All of our policies were entirely organic. They came from the local community, and we run on that mandate. And that's something that political parties rarely do. We took what local people wanted and we put that into practice of what was intended to do for Salford City Council and the surrounding area. We've got huge plans to turn brown space like this, brownfield site, which is nature has reclaimed because people haven't been using it, and to turn them into nature reserves, and in tandem with that have local community groups clean up plastic pollution. We have a democracy that rules pretty much every aspect of our lives, but at not one stage, and it's actually quite rare that people are entertained with the notion of taking part in that. They don't really tell you at school, and they don't really tell you at high school, and the only way you get involved is by chance or because you've got an interest in it, or a family member or a friend knows about it. You need only ask yourself, what have you done outside of your day job and your own leisure time to help your community or do something for your neighbours? And do you know your neighbour's name? Do you know what issues affect your street? Not to say there's no community in Salford Quays, but the more tile blocks they build and the more antisocial our lives become with social media, I do think it's important that people come together to do community schemes like this. Everybody has an ideal view of how things should be and how they want things to be in society and the environment, and we all know some of the issues that we face, but what have you actually done about those things that you care about? And that's sometimes where it starts, and it starts small, and what have you done about these things that you care about?
So there we go, Alex Warren. He's actually asked that question there to us. What have you felt passionately about and what have you guys done about it, particularly from a political stance? So does anyone want to take this one? Go on, Eva.
I feel very passionately about equality, I guess, on all spectrums, and justice. Primarily what I do is I attend protests and information meetings organised by people at the University of Manchester. Like weekly they have gatherings on political talks, just so I can stay informed and stay on top of the matter. And I do enjoy attending protests as well. I think they're important. They're an important tool of showing public opinion and feeling that support around you of people that share your views on something that you're passionate about. I think is great. Yeah.
Fantastic. Adam, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of thing to talk about in terms of passion for different things. Very much like what we were saying there. I think equality is a key thing, as can be seen here at the University of Salford. There's a lot of accessibility for disabled people. You can, if you're I know there was I think there's a second or third year journalism student that's in a wheelchair, and they're able to get around the building with ease. So I think it's equality is a key thing to make sure people get right.
Fantastic. And I believe we have a question from the audience from Charlotte. Charlotte, do you have a question for us?
Yeah, so we hear a lot of talk from the government about climate change. Who do the panel think is most responsible for reversing the effects of climate change?
Fantastic. Does anyone want to take this one? Joe?
Am I going? Yeah. Not us. Not us as individuals, not us as a country. I find it quite hilarious, actually, that Extinction Rebellion, block ambulances and single working mums trying to get their kids to school, when we aren't the problem. They are looking in completely the wrong place, and they're quite frankly, I was going to swear, but they're quite frankly irritating the wrong people. When you look at carbon emissions across the world, the Global Carbon Project recorded that in 2020, China emitted 10.5 billion tonnes of CO2. The US was number 2 on that list with half of that, 5.2 billion tonnes. We are nowhere near that as a country. Not only are we not even in the top 15 of emitters, but we're in the top 5 countries for reducing our emissions. We're actually down 48%. The UK has managed to reduce its emissions by 48% since 1990. If you are looking to pin the blame on someone, corporations and large emitting countries are the problem. When you look at, I think it's the top 20 corporations that are the worst polluters, only one of them is British, and that's BP. The rest of them are either state-owned energy firms from South America, Russia, China, or they're privately owned entities that are based out of the US and other large nations as well. So the point is that us here are not the problem. Putting energy efficiency bulbs in your house is probably only going to reduce your bills by about 25 pence a year. What it's not going to do is make a dent in global emissions.
So do you think as a population we are all doing our bit, or do you think there's certain areas that actually everyone could improve on?
It's difficult. I think we are doing our bit, but we're doing more than our fair share. You know, working class people and students, people like all of us here are bearing the brunt of the cost of living crisis, part of which has been induced by incredibly green policies that are making the cost of everything for us far more expensive than it needs to be. You know, something as small as, I don't know about you, but the last time I had a milkshake in McDonald's, my God, that is difficult because they've replaced it with a sodding paper straw. Do you know what I mean? What that's not doing is reducing global emissions. What it's doing is irritating me. It's irritating millions of other people for no reason.
Eva, how about yourself?
I don't know if I agree with all of that. I understand. I do think like the plastic paper straw debate is a bit small if we're looking at the bigger picture. I do, however, think that the UK government hold a very large responsibility in cutting climate emissions. I think the reason China has so many emissions is because it's producing all the things that we use in the UK, and it's also a very large country compared to the UK. So I think, you know, net emissions can't really be compared there. Additionally, I think the UK government is very happy to fund new oil extraction in the North Sea. It's actually the most profitable country for oil companies to extract their oil. So companies like BP, Exxon, Shell get hundreds of millions of public money every year subsidised, and they don't pay a single penny in tax. And the UK government just keeps, you know, agreeing to more and more of these projects. And the reason it's so profitable for these companies to go to the UK is because we pay less than $2 per barrel of oil, whereas say a country like Norway, they pay $21, I believe. So it's a huge difference. So no wonder these countries are coming to the UK, where the government is more than happy to pay them so much money to keep destroying the environment.
So Adam, how about yourself? Who do you think is responsible for reversing the effects of climate change?
I think, like Joe was saying there, it's not going to be anyone in this room. You can all do your bit to be able to sort of reduce emissions. I think you could potentially look at what's happened in the past, but I think it's probably not a blame game. It's sort of maybe trying to sort that out in however small or large way that can do that.
Fantastic. Now, back in 2018, you may remember Greta Thunberg stood outside Swedish Parliament holding a sign that read "School Strike for Climate." From that, it spread into a worldwide movement, with school communities going out on strike once a week across the globe. And that was no different here in Manchester, and this week we sat down and spoke to the founder of Youth Strike Manchester about what she feels needs to be done to combat climate change.
Hi, I'm Emma Greenwood. I'm an 18-year-old youth voice and climate activist from Bury. Over the past 3 years, I've been working a lot to help ensure that youth voice is represented on a local level and national level through being Youth MP. And I also helped push a lot for climate justice and climate action through the youth strikes that you might have seen within Manchester, and then also attending events like COP26. Youth Strike for Climate Manchester was founded in February 2019, And it was basically coordinated to help give young people a voice in pushing for climate action. And even though we couldn't vote because a lot of us were under 18, it gave us an opportunity to stand united with other young people around the world that had formed in response to Greta Thunberg. Young people see it as important that those in power tackle the climate crisis and treat it with the severity that it deserves. I think the global north is predominantly responsible for reversing climate change. Disproportionately, we contribute to carbon emissions, but unfortunately, places in MAPA countries in the global south are the most affected. And we also have the most kind of billionaires and big corporations that are contributing the most to the climate carbon emissions. And inevitably, we need to be willing to sacrifice certain things in order to ensure that people around the globe can be protected. As a young person, what is one action you would like to see the government take to tackle the climate crisis?
Thank you for that, Emma. So, Eva, what do you think?
I think the one action the government should take is stop all new fossil fuel extraction. I know that is a big ask, but if we want to stay below the crucial 1.5 degree rise in global temperature, then we're going to have to cut all emissions in half in 8 years. And the only way to do that, I think, is to stop all new fossil fuel extraction.
Adam, agree or disagree?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a difficult one. It's probably not my area of expertise, but I think if, like I was saying before, it's if you can look to be able to do something to be able to tackle the climate crisis, then it's something you should be able to do.
Do you think it'd be an easy process to cut your emissions just fully?
I think it's not going to be easy, but never say never with anything really. So I think if it's possible, it's sort of that want and that to be able to do that.
Joe, how about yourself?
I agree with Eva. I think we should move away from fossil fuels. When you look at, for example, the SNP just sold off, I think, most of the seabed around Scotland for absolute pennies. I think it's time to look at alternative options. Nuclear is the option for me. I'm massively in favour of nuclear energy. It is the cleanest, most cost-effective option for powering countries. It's incredibly powerful. It's the only carbon emissions that actually come from nuclear power are when you're building the thing in the first place. It has incredibly low carbon emissions when it's actually producing energy. That's it, to be honest. I don't think there's anything more. Everyone else is, everything else hits working class people. When you look at renewables, those incredibly green energy policies, who's subsidising them? We're paying for them when they're unreliable, incredibly costly, and they produce basically no energy at all. Nuclear energy is incredibly safe as well, and like I said, it's cost effective. I think it's the best way to go.
Are there any cons you see with nuclear energy? You've said a lot of the potential advantages.
Yeah, people often go Chernobyl straight away. People just think it's incredibly dangerous, or Fukushima, for example. There have only ever been 2 recorded incidents of radioactive material getting out of a nuclear power plant in the UK. Both of them were in Scotland back in the 50s. They're incredibly safe. When you look at other countries, for example, where they don't have such safe regulations, or if they're built on a fault line, for example, then you're going to have some issues, but we don't here in the UK.
Fantastic. Courtney, I believe we've got some questions on the screen, have we?
We do. We have a nice little tweet from Taig. It says, do the panel make conscious efforts to reduce their impact on the environment when living their everyday life? I think it has to start with the individuals. So, are you guys making conscious effort to reduce your impact on the environment?
I can start first. I mean, I don't eat meat. I think that's one of the best things you as an individual can do to reduce your carbon emissions is at least reduce or cut out meat consumption. I also like to walk and take public transport and things like that. And while I do see the importance of individual action, like Joe was saying earlier, and I do agree, I think, say, the straw debate or the taking the bus instead of the car, well, I see the power in that. The ocean was on fire last year. I think we need to see the bigger picture of what's actually happening, and everyone is free to do as much as they can. Say, saving water and energy, that's good for yourself as well and good for your bills, but I don't think the blame should be placed on individuals.
Joe, how about yourself?
Unlike Eva, I only eat meat. I don't eat many vegetables at all. So there was a report that came out not that long ago, actually. It was a survey from The Independent. They surveyed 2,000 people, and 64% of people said that they wanted to live sustainably but couldn't afford to. Sustainable living is incredibly expensive. You just walk into any vegan cafe and they're charging you £9 for a bagel that's been organically sourced, when I could go and buy 10 in Tesco's for about 20p. I personally wouldn't steer away from eating meat at all because it's already been produced. So me buying it, some people will say, will only fuel companies from to continue producing it. But at the same time, it kind of goes back to my earlier point. Like, why should we? Why should we change our way of living when we're not the problem? Why should we have to suffer for it? And just one example that really irritates me, I saw it a couple of days ago. Sadiq Khan has expanded the size of the ULEZ in London in order to try and encourage people to stop driving, for example. But what that's done is it's now affected about 300,000 people who have cars, and that is often their only mode of transport. So they're now forced into paying an extra £400 a month. Imagine that, an extra £400 a month just because you have a car and that's the only way that you can get to work. So when you look at policies like that, I just think it's ridiculous. Why should we have to change?
And Adam, on our diet, please, for the sake of balance, tell me you're a pescatarian.
Well, no, I was going to say I'm probably sit in the middle with sort of the mix of the fruit and the veg, the meat and the veg even. Public transport is a very good point. It's mentioned London there. It's sort of growing in Greater Manchester. We've seen Manchester Metrolink sort of over the last 20 years heavily expand, and it's expected to expand even further. The Mayor of Greater Manchester wants to have that integrated public transport system, sort of buses, trams, trains, and I think that's probably the one for me, that's sort of rather than driving to use public transport.
Sure. And we've got a question from the audience. I believe this is for Alfie.
Hi, you mentioned this before. So we got rid of plastic straws in favour of paper and metal ones, and I get that every little helps, but did they shift the focus too much to that, and did we get away from the real problem in the global north?
So, Joe, I believe this is something you discussed earlier, because we have spoken about straws already, but is there anything you'd like to expand on with that?
Yeah, I will completely agree with you. I think, unfortunately, and I'll agree with Eva, the way that I just flippantly use it in an argument means that we're not talking about anything else. Do you know what? I wouldn't put it past large corporations with massive PR companies who are peddling the focus on that. So many companies, believe it or not, are actually a lot more devious than we think they are, and will peddle stories in the papers, trying to put the focus on that. Because it's such an obvious thing to all of us, we don't often, when you go about your daily life, you don't often think, oh, I wonder what BP's carbon emissions are this month. What affects you there and then is not being able to get your milkshake up a straw. So it's those common things that you will all remember. That's why it's a really commonly used argument. So I'll completely agree with you. Yes, the focus has been shifted away from what the real problems are.
I think greenwashing is the word there, especially by these big companies telling us what to do when they are the ones that are the actual problem. What was it, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the emissions, like Joe was saying earlier. Me using a paper straw is not going to make that much of a difference. And it always sounds bad because I'm not saying that, we should be using excessive plastic, but I completely agree with Joe here. It is a way for those responsible to put the blame on the individual when that's not the problem.
Adam, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think the milkshake is the milkshake and the straw debate is the one I'm sort of torn between it, because I think it's obviously good to sort of try and get away from plastics, but I think, like Joe was saying there about the PR of that, it focuses it a lot on the brand, that are changing to different straws and gets them sort of more attention. Whether that's good or bad.
We've talked a lot there about PR and about social media, so we're actually going to wrap this up and move more towards social media. We've got a question from Charlie, I believe. Is that right?
Hiya, yeah. So I think we can all agree that social media has a lot of benefits, but we're seeing more and more headlines with abusive comments, abusive tweets, especially revolving around racism. So do we think it's about time that we enforce a requirement to have a verified ID when opening a social media account?
Adam?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yes, I think is the simple answer to that, because there's a lot of faceless accounts out there on Twitter. There's a lot of spam out there on Twitter where you get sort of different bots that have replied to the same tweet about 50 times saying the same thing. And I think I know the England football team was mentioned in that as well. So from the abuse that they took in the Euros last summer, which wasn't acceptable at all. But yeah, I think verified IDs, the simple answer to that is probably yes.
Joe?
This one is quite contentious for me. A bit of a controversial opinion. I'm a massive advocate of free speech, and I will, protest for it and protect it. But when it comes to something like this, it's a very slippery slope. Once you create legislation that does, that protects something against something that is subjective, offence is in the eye of the beholder, shall we say. But anonymity doesn't stop racists from being racist. All it does is puts it out there. It means that people just see it. I think we often have to look on the flip side. The people that are protected from anonymity, people like whistleblowers, victims of crime, domestic abuse, people trying to get away from stalkers who are setting up new lives for themselves, journalists, for example, trying to get stories. Anonymity is an incredibly important part of life, a right to privacy. But don't get me wrong, racism and online bullying is 100% awful. People shouldn't be doing it, people should be nicer. But what is often overlooked is that police can actually identify most people online already. All it takes is, I think we all do it. You find out who your ex-boyfriend's new partner is and you go on social media and you've managed to track them down in about 10 seconds. So when it comes to things like that, it's a very obvious example of how we know how easy it is. So imagine if you've got police tools at your disposal. One example that I wanted to mention was from 2007 to 2012, South Korea required social media sites to collect national identification numbers from its citizens. And what that actually did was it smothered free speech entirely. And I think it was Twitter and Facebook saw about 95% of its users leave the sites entirely. Because people didn't feel like they could speak freely anymore. People didn't feel like their opinions could be heard without prosecution. But just one final thing, I think there's a guy, a journalist at The Independent, who actually said on this very issue about the racism that the England footballers got. He said that the solution isn't to require the most vulnerable to give up their last shred of protection to stop racists. Just teach racists not to be horrible people. I think, why should everyone else in society have to suffer, and like I've said, the most vulnerable people, just because some people are assholes, really?
Do you not think that this could start to kind of bring some accountability to the issue, though?
It's difficult because I would rather people have full freedom of speech and full freedom of expression without worrying about prosecution at all, than bring in something like that to protect people. I think if you're on social media, then you're putting yourself out there, and that goes both ways as well. You are putting yourself out there to be open to hearing what other people have to say about you. I will, when it comes to freedom of speech and something on this topic, and one thing that I've fallen out with a lot of people about is, I was verbally abused, homophobically abused in the streets, but I specifically wouldn't report it because that is their right. It is their right to say that to me. It is their right to be able to say that without fear of prosecution. Where I draw the line, though, is incitement of physical violence. I think if you get to that point, then obviously that is a crime. If you're inciting people to harm someone else, then yes. But if it's all verbal, I would actually protect and I advocate for my verbal abuser's right to be able to do that in the street to me.
Fantastic. And we've got a question from the audience at this point. I believe the question here, is the right to free speech the right to a platform? Eve, what do you think on that?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess if you're on social media, that automatically gives you a platform in some way. Now, obviously, you have to build that platform depending on how many people you want to reach. I do think I 100% believe in free speech, but I draw the line at the incitement of hatred, even over like physical violence. There are countries, say Germany, where incitement of hatred is criminalized, it's illegal, and I think it works well, and I don't see why we shouldn't, for example, use that here in the UK. I think people, posting their dogs or their ice cream on Instagram shouldn't open them up to abuse. I don't think, no one asked for that. And I do understand, everyone can do what they like, but I don't think racism or homophobia is subjective. I think it's very clear when something's racist or homophobic, for example. So I don't think free speech equals the right to a platform. Yeah.
And a question from our Twitter.
Yeah, we've got another question here from Twitter about social media, which is very apt considering. So we've got a tweet from James Smith saying, I think social media can be overwhelmingly a force for good. Why should we take it away from people?
And obviously, as you say, Courtney, a question from social media.
About social media.
So,
yeah.
Adam, what do you reckon?
I think there's obviously a line to be drawn, sort of, to be able to take it away from people. Obviously, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the other sort of social networking sites have sort of been able to report different posts, and those companies have rules and procedures in place to be able to take down certain accounts, certain tweets. But it is a force for good in certain aspects. Sort of talking about
just leading from that, Eva, do you think social media is an overwhelming force of good?
I wouldn't say it's either an overwhelming force of good or bad. I think it presents itself very equally. I see the power of social media, especially talking about politics and things like that. The way things get shared very quickly, I think is great. However, I do sometimes think that not everyone needs to be able to express their opinion on everything. And I think social media does give you, that, I'm sure Joe would disagree, but social media does give you that power. I don't think everyone should have an opinion on everything, especially on social media, because things are so simplified, especially looking at recent conflicts in the world, recent problems. Everything's simplified into an infographic that everyone shares on their story. That's not what politics is, and I think that's very modern kind of change that we've seen, and I definitely do see the danger in doing that. Yeah.
Joe?
Well, I assume the question is referring to sort of deplatforming, and everyone should have the right to social media. Deplatforming really irritates me, because what has happened is someone sat in an office somewhere has decided that what that person has said isn't for them. Who are you to be so arrogant as to tell someone else that their opinion is nowhere near as important or as valid as yours? I think everything is subjective. One man's compliment is another man's hate crime or insult. I've had it happen to me before. People have called me a gay slur, for example, and I care. But other people, will report it. So that's where it becomes difficult, because you could have offended one person when in actual fact the other person may not have thought it was offensive at all. So social media is definitely a force for good as well. Just on that, I mean, if you take a look at Babe, for example, she's managed to raise, I think it's £5 million for her cause just in the last few days alone. So social media is definitely a force for good, but it's also definitely I wouldn't say a force for evil, but it gives platforms to people who may be considered evil by other people to have their opinions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. Well, you've heard what our panel thinks. So remember to keep the conversation going with hashtag the comment section on socials. Tune in next week when we head south to Birmingham and look at levelling up and the increase in the cost of living. Thanks to our wonderful panel for joining us, and have a very good rest of your evening.